No, probably not till. You're right. You can hear everything. I can hear your sink. Drip, drip, drip. Oh, drinking? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second edition of Lesbian Lives live streamed. My name is Elise Chenier, and I am a historian who lives and works on the unceded traditional territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples in Burnaby, British Columbia. And last fall, I started running a series of community events called Lesbians Live. I'm an oral historian, and we would gather together as a community, and I would interview a lesbian or queer woman live, and we were live streaming it, and I on a sort of related but separate project, I created an exhibit called An Army of Lovers, and that opened on International Women's Day, March 8th. And of course, everything has closed down since then, so we decided to bring the exhibit online. And what I'll be doing in the coming weeks is interviewing or speaking with a different woman who was featured in the exhibit, to learn a little bit more about their life and their experience. But today we're here to talk about Phyllis Lyon. She passed away this week. She was 95 years old and she died of natural causes. And I know that she and her partner Del touched many of us, our lives, in different ways. So I wanted to use this opportunity to remember her. And for me, ritual is becoming increasingly important in my life. So I have here a candle that I use. And so in memory of Phyllis, I'm going to light my candle, and that will burn throughout today's live stream for Phyllis while we remember her, thank her, honor her for the incredible many things that she did. So I'm going to just begin by giving a little bit of just the briefest outline of her origins, and then I'm going to bring on a couple of people to talk more personally about their own experience and their own memories. But I'm really hoping that a lot of younger people who might not be familiar with Phyllis, are joining us today, and they'll learn about this incredible trailblazing person. So Phyllis was born in 1924 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She went to school in California, and she became a journalist, and she was a very successful journalist, particularly for a woman in the 1950s. In 1952, she was in Seattle working on a magazine, and that's where she met her lifelong partner, Del Martin. A year after they met, they moved to San Francisco. So that's 1953. Now, at that time, that was one of the worst times to be queer in American history and Canadian history, too. There was a Cold War on, and for those of you not familiar with it, this is going to sound completely weird because it was. The Cold War was a war between the quote-unquote free capitalist world and communism, the communist world, Russia, communist Russia. And somehow, well, there is a how, but I won't get into it, homosexuals were characterized as a threat to the free world. Because they were gay, the perception at the time that became very popular and common was that they could be blackmailed by Russian communists and forced to give away state secrets. So in the 1950s, homosexuals were not only seen as sinners, perverted, and even mentally deranged, but they were also seen as a threat to national security. So it was really not a good time to be gay. So that context is really important to understand what it meant when, in 1955, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon create an organization called Daughters of Bilitis. Now, it's called this strange name so as not to be obvious about, it's not Lesbians International or Lesbians Inc., right? So that people wouldn't necessarily know on first hearing what this group was for. But their intention was to provide a space, a social space where lesbians could get together and meet each other. At that time, really, you either were meeting through personal networks, if you were lucky enough to find other women, or you were going to bars. And the bars tended to be in pretty rough neighborhoods. That was the only place queer people were welcome. Women, especially. Men had it a little bit different. not always places where women felt very comfortable. So they wanted to provide a different kind of environment. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So I wanted to say that in today's, hopefully we'll keep it to 45 minutes. I wanted to say, come for the memories, but stay for the critical history. So after we talk to E.T. Turner and Pat, I'm going to talk a little bit about, how historians think about how Phyllis Line is being remembered, and introduce some of the critical thinking parts. But I really want to emphasize on remembering, because I think it's so important that we stop and pause and just honor people who have done who mean something to us, whether they've done a lot or not, who have a personal meaning to us. And Phyllis Lyon is someone who definitely has a lot of meaning to a lot of people. So and I guess the segue to bringing on E.T. And let me just here we go. There you are, E.T. Now you're streaming. We can all see you. You want to give a little wave there?
Hi there.
So as a segue to E.T., this group, Daughters of Abilitas, later published a newsletter called The Ladder, and this newsletter was mailed all over the United States and to Canada, internationally. It became really, really important for a lot of lesbians. So, E.T., tell us, you're from LA, and you tell us, when did you come out and how did you first get connected to The Ladder?
Well, I've probably been out in some ways since the mid to late 60s. I didn't come out 24/7 probably till shortly before I retired. It was just too dangerous to do that for most of us. So, yeah, I grew up in California, in Southern California, and I happened to be living in the LA area in the mid 60s, 68, 69, 70, when a lot of stuff was happening. Shall I continue?
Yes, please go.
Yeah. Okay.
Carry on.
There were a lot of things happening all at once, and it was really a great time to be alive. It was pretty exciting. There was the civil rights movement going, the women's lib movement was going, and then gay rights started coming to the forefront. I think the first Pride Parade in LA happened in 67. There were a lot of rap groups going on, if you remember rap groups, and
Not the music.
Yeah. So I saw Phyllis and Dell at several presentations, meetings, things like that. I can't say I was personal friends with them. I met them, I talked to them on a few occasions. What they were doing was really exciting. To be out lesbians and talking about it was pretty exciting. My partner at the time had joined the Daughters of Bilitis, and we started getting the magazine, The Ladder, which arrived in a plain brown envelope. Didn't know you were getting. I was quite interested in it. I volunteered to assist with the magazine in whatever way I could, so I did some typing, and then I interacted with Barbara Greer, who lived probably about an hour away from me, who was working on the magazine. I got a couple of poems published in the magazine, so that was pretty thrilling to have that happen. What else do you want me to talk about?
Yeah.
Just basically, should I read the poem?
Yeah, why don't you read the poem? And
okay.
I think it's important for people to realize that not only was the Ladder a rare source of information, but if you wanted to express in a positive way your feelings, your experiences as a lesbian, it was the only real outlet I mean, of course, in the 70s with the women's movement, more outlets became available. But yeah, it was an important place for people to be able to share. So, and you had that the magazine provided you with that opportunity. Yeah.
Absolutely. And there were drawings that were in it, there was poetry, there were some little stories in it. So it was sharing things with other lesbians also. So this one I wrote back in about 69, 68. It's called Question. As a child, I walked cold streets of cement. The sunshine fell on others and nothing touched me. When I was 12, my body changed and boys looked at it. A question arose in my mind. When I was 13, Andrea kissed me in the girls' bathroom and my question was answered. So that was sort of I always, it's that you always know you're different, and, you're questioning all of that, your identity. And then I met her, and this happened. That was my first girlfriend. And so my question was answered. I knew who I was,
Yeah.
basically.
And you also worked on the ladder. You were a volunteer. You did typesetting. Is that right?
Yeah, I did some typing, yeah, as well. And I don't know, somewhere in my life, I lost my copies. I had my copies of the ladder, and I moved, several different times, and I don't know what happened to them. But thanks to you, I know that they're archived.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to hear that.
That's great. Okay.
When
Yeah, go
the
ahead.
book,
Sorry, go ahead.
well, do you want me to talk about the book a little bit about
Yes,
Lesbian Woman?
that's right.
Okay.
So you and
Well,
I both
I
we both have our copies.
Here's my copy from 1972. As you can see, it's been well used, well read.
So I'm just gonna ask
I
anybody
think
else
what
out there
was
who's tuning in, if
incredible.
you have a copy, let us know on the Facebook or YouTube comment, and maybe send us a picture of you holding up your copy. Go ahead, Et.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
That would be great. I think for me, seeing that book was just incredible, because before that, if you looked for books about lesbians, they were written by psychiatrists or psychologists, or somebody who really had no idea, of course, what it was like to be a lesbian, because lesbians write books or they weren't published. So it was the first time that you had a book by lesbians about lesbians.
Mm.
So that was pretty thrilling. And so you got a realistic picture of lesbians. And one thing that came out in the book is that lesbians were all kinds of women. You couldn't pick them out of a crowd necessarily. They were mothers, they were teachers, they were factory workers, they were all kinds of women. So that was really great. So it broke down some stereotypes. Also, at that time, when you came out, you sort of had to pick whether you were butch or femme. That was the roles that people had, and it broke that down as well. It talked about women who were not either of those things, and that's not the way they related. Uh, in the book, they tied in with other civil rights movements that we all needed to be working together to get civil rights or equal rights for everybody. So that was another important thing to me. And Betty Friedan, who founded NOW, and who was at the forefront of the women's rights, and that NOW was National Organization for Women, if anybody doesn't know what that stands for. She called lesbians the Lavender Menace and didn't want lesbians to be part of NOW, and actually orchestrated getting Rita Mae Brown out of NOW. So we weren't really welcome in the women's movement. So basically, what I liked about the book is that Del and Phyllis said, we don't care really what you think about us. We're here. We exist. We've always existed. We're always going to. And we're going to talk about who we are. We're not going to leave it to other people to do that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they inspired me. I've been pretty much a lifelong gay activist. More once I retired, I became that became the focus of my efforts in my life, and so I was inspired by pioneers like them, like Harvey Milk.
Mm.
People like that inspired me to do that. So it had an effect on my life for sure.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, ET. So stay on the
Yeah.
line here, and I'm going to bring on Pat now.
Okay.
Hey, Pat.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good, good.
Can you tell us what Phyllis Line? Well, tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and a little bit about your own background and your own coming out, and then tell us what Phyllis meant to you.
Okay. Well, I'm originally from Connecticut. I lived in San Francisco during the '60s, and I came up to Canada in '69, and it was very easy. Came across as a visitor. 2 weeks later, I went back and applied and got landed immigrant status. So it was, like I say, quite easy back then. And then I continued, and I've lived in Canada, and now I'm a citizen of Canada as well as the United States. So and then I've started getting involved mainly I mean, when I was in San Francisco, there was a lot going on, and I was straight then, but I was very involved with a lot of communities, but it was just, there was a lot going on. And so when I got to Canada, and then I ended up in Vernon in the Okanagan at some point. I was getting away from a violent domestic situation for myself, and I ended up at the Women's Center there in the mid '70s, and that was also the mark of the decade of women. And all of a sudden, I just jumped into everything that was going on there, and we went and lobbied our MLA for one thing, and then and federal money was quite prevalent then, so for grants, so I wrote up a grant and started an organization called Dawn, Direct Action for Women in Need. And then around that same time, Phyllis and Dell came to Vancouver to do a talk on domestic violence, or wife battering as it was called then. And I came down to go to that. And not only for my own personal needs, but also for the work that I was doing in Vernon at the time. And I was just blown away by them and by everything that was said. And there was a lot of energy for people to do things then, and particularly feminists. So we went back. I went back to the Okanagan, and I started organizing, co-organizing for a conference on violence, domestic violence in Vernon. And when I first started it, people said, "Oh, no one's going to come," blah, blah, blah. And then when it did happen, it was just filled with people, like social workers, people from the John Howard Society, everyone imaginable. What was really funny, I can still remember this, though, on the panel was mostly all of us women, and I think there was one man there for whatever role he was. And some of the men in the audience, they found that really hard to handle, because remember, this is the '70s, that they're coming to a conference and they're going to be listening to all these women, they had a hard time around that. Anyway, that's how I met Phyllis and Dell. I mean, I don't know if they would have remembered me personally, because there was a lot of people there. What I also find interesting, because when I went online, I found out that they were the first national hearing that they gave was before the U.S. Commissioner on Civil Rights, talking about domestic violence. That was in 1980. Mm. Well, it would have had to be the Vernon conference, or I mean the Vancouver conference would have had to be before 1980, because I came back to Vancouver in '79. So it was sometime between '75 and '79 when that went on, which was interesting. And I haven't been able to find anything so far about the conference itself. I'd like to, just to see if there's something recorded. And I also wanted to say that what was interesting is you talking. I mean, hearing about the ladder, and sending it out in paper bags and like that. Well, what followed it 10 years later was the Lesbian Connection, which has now been going on for 40 years, and they too, and it's an international magazine for women, and they too used to have to send it out in paper bags stapled with no reference at all to where it came from. So
Yeah.
history repeated itself, or history.
Right.
So how important were they, Del and Phyllis? It's hard to talk about just Phyllis without talking about both of them. How important were they to changing that climate from one where you had to put things in a brown wrapper, you had to use a pseudonym to participate, to now when many of us, not all of us, but many of us feel quite comfortable being very out in our lives and walking around with our lesbian books in our hand?
Well, I think their courage inspired others of us. Their courage to be out there talking and to be proud of who they were. It's a long process for people to totally come out and be out, completely. But they certainly inspired that, I think, in people.
And I also think that they were a part of the feminist movement and the women's movement. And as E.T. was saying, and certainly up here was the same thing, when lesbians were out and involved with that, they weren't necessarily accepted by straight women at that time. But I think what they did was change that whole thing, or started the movement for other women to look at lesbians and to accept them, or to at least address their own homophobia or lesbophobia. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's true, and they were the first lesbian couple to join now as a couple. They had to sort of fight to be enrolled as a couple, but they were the first.
And what do you think gave them the courage or the audacity to be out at that time? Like what kind of person was willing or able to be out at that time?
Well, I never talked to them specifically about that, but I think they were like a lot of us. We saw the injustice in what was going on and not having equal rights, and real negative things being written about homosexuality and period. And maybe I'm just going to assume that they felt angry about that, and they felt angry enough to be moved to start saying, this isn't okay. I'm going to speak up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think they would have had, the courage of their convictions, that they had every right. They had every right
Yeah.
to be treated and accepted like anybody else. And that's what it takes, is people like that, pioneers who take a big chance, particularly back then.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and for them, it really paid off. I mean, they were able to, as you say, participate in so many other things and really push this the variety of issues around women's health, women's safety, but also lesbian health and safety, and so on, all the way to the highest levels. So we saw, when she passed away, Nancy Pelosi, the New York Times, some of the high people at the very highest levels acknowledging it. And I have to say, for myself, probably about 20 years younger than the two of you, like I'm old enough for it still to be shocking. I'm still slightly shocked when I see mainstream media, doing headline stories. Oh, this important gay pioneer died, because when I came out in 1990, that never would have happened, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
I also
Even Mark and I at the time went to a now rap group. We used to go to it, and we didn't tell them we were a couple. I'm sure they sort of figured it out, but nobody ever asked us. But we didn't feel totally safe saying that in this group.
right.
Pat?
Well, no, it just left me. It'll come
Okay.
back.
I know what you mean.
Oh, I know what I was going to say. It was mainly, I think that the conversation we're having, the fact that, Phyllis Lyon and her death made headlines. It's like all these things I think is so important, particularly for younger women, for younger anybody, to have this history, because so much history has been lost, or people who have a lot of rights now, and there's always more to work for, but they don't. A lot of people don't know where it came from, and I mean, even for myself, and with everything's going on now with this pandemic, I really didn't know that much about a lot of the history about other pandemics, and it's made me study a lot more because of this. And hopefully it's reaching, students and women and anybody who's interested in history.
Yeah, I do think that's one of the things that happens when important people die, is it gives an opportunity for a generation to be introduced to them. So yeah, like you, I do hope that's happening. If anybody out there listening has any questions, please post them, and we'd be delighted to answer them. I'm gonna, and while I see if anybody does post any questions, I'll just ask you both one final question, because this is the point that when I put my historian, when we shift from memorial and celebration to sort of critical historical thinking, the one thing I want to talk about, which is same-sex marriage. They were the first couple to be married in California, I think, once that became legal. And, and a lot of the photos out there online, and a lot of the stories, actually, the news stories out there focus on that. Some of them I saw, like half the news story was really about their wedding. And I wonder if you could comment on two things. How do you feel, like, how do you emotionally, respond to that, right? Like their marriage, getting married, the right to marry. What does that mean to you personally? And then sort of looking back through the passage of time as two women who lived through the 60s and 70s, that critical period of change, would you ever have guessed this is where we would be? This is where it would end, is, that's what they would be celebrated for, is their marriage. What does that mean to you?
I think that luckily most of the stories I read, gay marriage has always been kept me from being an equal person to everybody else who could get married, and I was never permitted to marry the woman that I loved. So it was very important. And when I saw the pictures and video of them getting married, it really almost brought a tear to my eye that this couple, after 50 some years, I think it was at that time, finally they could get married. So I thought it was really important. I think, yeah, that we need to not lose the importance of everything that they did and the equality that they worked for. But I do think it was a good symbol, an important symbol to see them like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Pat?
Yeah, well, I think because same-sex marriage is still a fairly new thing for most people, around the world, certainly even in North America, that bringing it out was important. There was when same-sex marriage started becoming legalized in Canada and the United States, there was also a whole sort of reaction by a lot of feminists, just saying this is, marriage is part of the whole patriarchy, and, didn't want to have anything to do with it, and still don't. And so, there's that way of looking at it as well. But I think the fact that they were chosen to be the first to be married in California was an honor to the other work that they've done, as well as being married. Yeah.
You had asked Elise about if I was surprised by it. And yes, I was, because I used to say there will never be legal gay marriage in the United States in my lifetime. So I'm really happy that I lived to see it happen, because I really never thought that it would.
Somebody has just shared a comment here about Urvashi Vaid's book, Virtual Equality, and LGBTQ folks acted as if we had rights we didn't have. She says, then we're surprised when they had to interact with legal systems. Pride celebrations don't equal civil rights. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that I'm going to speak a little bit to that point that River is making there. Okay. Thank you to you, both of you, so much for coming and being part of this celebration of Phyllis Lyon's life. I'm going to talk a little bit more on this gay marriage point, same-sex marriage point a little bit, and you're welcome to stick around. And if you want to chime in, please do. But for the moment, I want to say thank you both for showing up and sharing with us your own personal memories. Did you have any last things you want to say about Phyllis before we go?
I just wanted to say thank you for doing this, and remembering and honoring her. And Barbara, it was nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Pat.
Yeah,
Pat,
thank,
I'm sorry. Oh,
thank you,
Pat.
Elise. Thank you. Yeah. No, this has been nice, and I look forward to more of these, to watching them. And are you going to be putting, or maybe it is, and I haven't known it. Are you going to put the exhibit itself online a lot
Yeah.
for people to see?
At the very last slide, I will show you the email address, the website address, but the exhibit is now
Okay.
online. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to, because I don't want to desecrate, I'm going to take my candle for Phyllis as I shift into some critical thinking mode, and I'm going to say, thank you, Phyllis. We honor you, we respect you, and appreciate everything about you. And now I will blow my candle out.
Right.
I want to separate sort of thinking critically with the work of honoring. I think both are so important. And actually, I've been working a lot with my students this past term on the question of honoring, because some of you will know that there is going to be the creation of a monument to people LGBTQ 2SA plus people who were purged from the Canadian federal government because of the Cold War, actually. And so I participated in that process. And historians have an ambivalent relationship to public history and to celebrating heroes, because as scholars, it's not that we don't value and recognize people who've done great things, but the problem, it's like that old great man history. When you focus on one great person, well, in the past, it tended to elevate the elites and write out women, LGBTQ people, working class people, people of color, and so on. So we're very ambivalent of heroes. And as a feminist, feminists also like other groups, tend to be non-hierarchical and not like to create heroes. So, but, people, like, we don't survive without each other, and people make a difference in our lives in small and big ways. So there's this, I guess in a way you could say, one as a scholar has to separate out those feelings of honoring and celebrating the individual versus doing the work of critical scholarly history. So if you're, it's very weird talking to just a screen and not having input. So if people want to make comments, that really helps me to know, I don't know, what I'm saying is interesting. It's landing somewhere. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the emphasis the mainstream media is putting on their same-sex marriage. And I come from a school of thought and politics and political practice that is deeply, on the one hand, very deeply critical of the way in which, not marriage in and of itself as a celebration and ceremony that celebrates the love of two people. I think on a personal level and a political level, that kind of recognition, to be seen and to be valued and honored, is so important. So Like the latter, as I was saying to E.T., like gave E.T. a place where she could express that moment of coming out and what that was like, and to an audience that appreciated it, that it wouldn't be pathologized, that it wouldn't become the subject of, why you need therapy and treatment and, something's wrong with you, but rather it's a positive thing. And so how do our relationships get recognized? And those kinds of ceremonies for some people are really, really valuable and meaningful. But on a different political level, there's been really excellent critiques written about the way in which the same-sex marriage movement, intentionally or unintentionally, had the effect of normalizing queerness. So stay with me here. So when you're queer, when you're not part of the norm, there are benefits to that, in that you are able to see the normative through a critical lens, because you see its shortcomings, you see how it doesn't work, you see how it can act in oppressive ways, and you are forced by necessity to craft new ways of being in the world, whether that is new relationship forms, relying on community in outside of capitalism, all kinds of ways. So the same-sex marriage movement celebrated queer people or same-sex attracted couples fitting into a very neoliberal, capitalist, hierarchical norm that erased or invisibilizes, I hate that word, but that actually might be a better word in this situation, the ways in which queerness had enabled us to challenge some of the oppressive ways in which normativity functions. So but here's the story I want to tell you. So I'm writing a book on, I'm not writing a book on same-sex marriage. So I've been actually working on this for a very long time. So here's what's interesting. Back in 1967, 68, 69, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon met with an emerging group of, it's been so long I've looked at my notes, I can't remember. The Council for Religion and Homosexuality, or Council on Religion and Homosexuality. And they weren't particularly interested in religion, but they, as sort of players in this sphere of activism, they participated in this weekend-long retreat. And one of the things that came out of that weekend-long retreat was the Christian ministers and pastors said, one thing we can do for same-sex couples to help is we can validate their relationships by blessing their unions. Okay, I just tucked my leg in, so I'm getting serious now. So by blessing their unions. And so they said in response, so I went through the archives and saw these notes. And so they were feminists, right? And so they said, well, we're not interested in marriage. That's not something we want. But, go for it, right? You want to bless unions, that's fine. If that's meaningful for other people, they should do that. So for me as a historian, what's really interesting is historical context. So why in the early 2000s do they get married, right? If in 1968 or 69, whatever year that was, they said marriage doesn't interest us, why is it interesting to them later, right? Is it because they're not feminists anymore? Is it because they're neoliberal? I don't think so. So historians, one thing we focus on is context. What is the context of the time? So if you look at 68, 69, what is the context, right? Women, the only option for women, like the normative stream for women, was to get married. It was normative in ways that people of my generation can't even imagine. Like, I read articles in early feminist journals of women like literally losing their shit, like falling apart because they wanted to make the choice not to marry, but it was so overwhelming because their whole life, that was what you do. And it was really like that really for me drove home just how overwhelming the pressure was. So for them, they're like, marriage has this very specific meaning to women in 1968, 69, which is like, it's about male ownership. It's a kind of relationship model that we don't want. Obviously, they stayed together their whole lives. They're not opposed to commitment. But by the 2000s, the other thing you need to know is there was reason to, marriage was actually part of a debate, and this is something that's not well known, but in the 70s, people were actively talking about marriage, and it was even debated on national TV whether lesbians and gays should be able to marry. So it was an active part of the conversation. Um, so jump ahead to the 2000s. The political picture is very, very different. It's actually more oppressive in some ways, because in the early 70s, it seemed like all these rights were inevitable, right? Everything was exploding. Change was happening so fast. There was no turning back. And of course, things don't repeat in the exact same way. But, oh my God, I'm going on too long. Sorry, everybody. The horse is out of the barn now. I'm in lecture mode. Anyways, okay, I'm going to wrap it up. But in 2000, it's very, very different. So getting married actually means something different. It's not I think, this is my interpretation. I've never talked to either one of them, but my interpretation of why would they do it in the 2000s is because the act of getting married now is very clearly about being queer, and the rise of this kind of incredible homophobia and anti-gay sentiment, like blocking the legal rights of gays in a way that didn't exist in the 70s, because things were really opening up. It's a bit, so it seemed, yeah. So it's oh, thanks, Billy, for saying. Billy says, what you're saying is interesting, but Billy is a student of mine. He has to say that. But thank you, Billy. So yeah, so I think that's why there's a certain value in the scholarly perspective. The context is really different. So I'm going to end on how I think one of the things I think they should be remembered for. So if I was an editor of these newspapers and was going to take out saying same-sex marriage is not the most important thing they did, and it's problematic because it erases the more radical things that they did. And I just want to say that Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon were never seen as radical. They weren't. Although what they did was very revolutionary, but they weren't radicals in the sense of like overthrow the system, right? They weren't that kind of radical. But simply to say lesbians and gays are equal, that was radical. One of the things they did was and what I think they should be remembered for, because it's more fitting with the times, and I think it's relevant to what's happening right now in the US, the need for healthcare, is they helped found, or they founded the Martin Lyon Health Services Center in San Francisco. Or yeah. Now, I just found out about this Thursday, so I don't have a deep knowledge of it. But the reason why I would focus on this is because the origin story is really great. There was a woman who showed up who had symptoms. This is in the 70s. She had symptoms that could be related to an STD, but she was a lesbian. And there was no research done on could lesbians get STDs? Could women pass STDs between them? So they get involved. Phyllis they get recruited to be involved in, let's do this study with lesbians in health, because if anybody has the network to reach out and develop trust to participate in this medical study, it would be them. So they participate in it, and then it gets shut down because the leaders at this clinic are like, what are you doing? Some gay thing? No, we don't do that here. And so then this center gets created. So it gets created as a way to provide space for the excluded, people who get excluded from the system. And healthcare, we know, is so vital, especially in this moment. Healthcare is so vital and so important. And so the center gets created. Now, I'm going to share with you a link to this story, because I think everybody needs to know this story. But to me, I'm much more interested in this kind of service, because the critique that people like scholars like Lisa Dugan have put forward about same-sex marriage in the more economic neoliberal critique is what it does is it privatizes public needs. So rather than accessing healthcare through a universal healthcare plan, you marry and access healthcare through private plans of your spouse or your partner. So that's a very neoliberal agenda. But creating a clinic like this where it's health for all, that's more of a socialist agenda. And that's the kind of agenda I support, right? Healthcare for all. And clearly in this moment, that's what we need. We need healthcare for all, right? And if you're not convinced, like your healthcare is compromised by the person next to you, if they have bad health, you're compromised. So even if it's only out of self-interest that you accept this principle, that's the principle. But I want to say one last thing. If there's one thing you want to do to remember Phyllis, I don't know her personally, but I think you should donate to this clinic. I saw when I was doing a little bit of research that there was some kind of an announcement, 90% of their funding has been cut. And when I went back this morning to refamiliarize myself with the story of the background of this clinic, the website had changed. So where it's now 360 Health. Fortunately, I know about something called the Wayback Machine, and it takes pictures of the internet. So you can, if websites have gone down, you can go back and sometimes they're there. So I'll share a link to the information. But if you want to do something to honor her memory, maybe what you should do is donate to this clinic that's in San Francisco. Because that's the kind of thing that benefits the collective. And I think that was what feminism was about, and a lot of radical gay rights work was about, was how do we advance our collective interests and our collective health. Okay, that's your lecture for today. Sometimes,
A very good one.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember Phyllis was important, but there are lots of good things to think about too, about what kind of world we want. And that's what they were doing, was world making new worlds. And, we're faced with this question right now, what kind of world do we want? So the last thing I'll
Right.
say, and this is I'll bring. I see you're still there, ET. So maybe I'll see if I can. Oh, and so are you, Pat. So the last thing I'll
I see
say.
Pat.
What's that? Go ahead.
I said, I see Pat.
Yeah, good. So the other thing feminists did in the 1970s is, everybody's talking about ending capitalism, and I think that's awesome. But I want to say, let's end bra wearing. Not wearing a bra right now, and thank God I never want to wear a bra again. Oh my God, so oppressive. So that's the movement I'm starting. Liberate my chest.
Okay, that's a good thing to end on. I think. Yeah, let's liberate chests everywhere.
Yay.
Well, one thing I wanted to say, because I had breast cancer and surgery, and I still have and I have scars there. And without wearing a bra, it's harder.
Oh, really?
Oh.
Yeah, I can affect. So yeah, I don't wear a really pointy steel bra and like that, but I need something to hold so it's less pain. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Learn something new. I didn't know that.
There
Yeah.
you go.
Well, maybe that's not true of other people with who's had surgery on breast cancer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pat.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you again, both. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I'm going to share with you just one moment so everybody can see. This is at the top of the screen is the address to how you will see the exhibit. And I'll send it to you guys so that you can see.
Okay.
And here is how you can browse the website to the link rather to our online oral history collections, and all of these videos will go in there. We also have a blog, which is not a blog, it's actually a podcast, and then my email address. So if you would like to join our newsletter so you get notified about these happening, please email me and let me know. You can subscribe. You can like our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube so that you'll always know. But we're going to be running these every Saturday at 11:30 Pacific time for the indefinite future. So I look forward to seeing you all next weekend. Enjoy this long weekend that is holy for so many people. And I hope you stay safe and get some good rest. Thank you, everybody.
Great to see you. Bye-bye.
Nice seeing you.
All right. Thanks, guys.